My name is Marlo Hensley. I'm 34 years old, and last Wednesday I drove to a house I own, knocked on the front door, and handed my sister a folder that ended 3 years of the most deliberate patience I have ever practiced in my life. She was wearing a floral dress. Her hair was done. She knew something was coming. I could tell by the way she answered the door like she'd been standing near it. And Derek was in the hallway behind her, looking exactly the way he always looked, broad-shouldered, friendly-faced, and completely unprepared for the weight of his own choices. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. I handed her the folder, said what I needed to say in 4 sentences, and walked back to my car. And I sat there in that driveway, the driveway of a house with my name on the mortgage, and I waited to feel something dramatic. Rage, maybe. Or grief. Or the particular satisfaction that people imagine revenge is supposed to feel like. What I felt instead was quieter than any of that. It felt like setting down something I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it had weight. But to understand what was in that folder, and why it mattered, I need to take you back. Not just to Derek, not just to the money. I need to take you back to the family that taught me, very early, that my job was to be the easy one. Before I do, if you just found this channel and you're already leaning in, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you're here for the rest of this. Like the video too, because it genuinely helps more than you might think. And if you know someone who has ever had to rebuild something from scratch because someone they trusted burned it down, share this with them. Now let me take you back to the beginning. I grew up in Bowling Green, Kentucky. My father, Gary, sold regional insurance and was perpetually one bad quarter away from a quiet crisis that nobody in our house was allowed to name out loud. My mother, Diane, managed the family's image the way some people manage a garden. Constantly, carefully, and with an eye toward what the neighbors could see from the street. There were 2 daughters in that house, me and Tessa. Tessa is 3 years younger than me, and from the time I was old enough to notice, the atmosphere in our home had a center of gravity, and that center was her. Not because my parents didn't love me, I want to be clear about that, they did, but Tessa was the child they relaxed around. She was louder, funnier, easier to be in a room with, and I was efficient, capable, the one who figured things out. When I was 13, my father lost a significant client and things got tight in a way nobody explained to us directly. But I noticed. I noticed when the second car disappeared from the driveway. I noticed when the vacation got canceled and replaced with a weekend at a state park. I noticed when my mother started buying the store brand cereal, and then the week after that, the other store brand cereal that was even cheaper. Nobody told me any of this was happening. I just paid attention. That night, the night I figured it out by listening through the kitchen wall, I got a notebook from my school bag and I started writing down everything I could observe about money in our house. Income, expenses, what I could infer, what I could confirm. I kept that notebook for 2 years. And if you want to understand who I am as an adult, that notebook is probably the place to start. I want to pause here for just a second because if you grew up in a house where the real things were never said out loud, where you became the kid who paid attention because no one else seemed to be, I think you already know what I mean when I say that it forms you. It forms you in ways that look like competence from the outside and feel like something lonelier from the inside. If that hits something in you, I really want you to hit that like button right now. Subscribe if you haven't already. And share this with someone who knows what it means to be the one who holds things together quietly. I see you. Now let me keep going. The rule in our house, the unspoken, never negotiated rule, was this. Marlo will be fine. Marlo figures things out. Marlo doesn't need what Tessa needs because Marlo is different. And I internalized that so completely that for most of my 20s, I would have told you it was a compliment. It wasn't. It was an exemption from care dressed up as a virtue. I graduated high school with a 4.1 GPA and got into Western Kentucky University on a partial academic scholarship. My parents sat me down and told me not to worry about the gap. There was money set aside from my grandmother's estate, earmarked for my education. My grandmother on my mother's side, a woman named Eloise, who kept her own accounts and left very specific instructions. I believed them. I used my scholarship gap money for living expenses and I trusted that promise. I trusted it for 2 years. And then junior year, I went to register for the spring semester and the numbers didn't add up. I spent 3 weeks calling the bursar's office, the financial aid department, and finally my father. What Gary Hensley eventually told me, in pieces, across several phone calls he kept trying to end early, was that he'd borrowed against the fund to cover a business shortfall. He'd meant to replace it. He hadn't. And the remainder, around $11,000, had been redirected when Tessa briefly expressed interest in taking some classes at the community college. Tessa attended for 1 semester. Tessa did not finish. I didn't scream at my father. I didn't cry on the phone. I said, very evenly, that I understood and that I would figure it out. And then I hung up and I sat on the edge of my dorm bed and looked at my hands for a long time. Then I went and picked up a second shift at the hotel front desk where I'd been working part-time, and I started the process of rebuilding the number I needed to finish my degree. It took 18 months, and I graduated a semester late, and I said very little about it to anyone. What I started doing in those 18 months, was teach myself everything I could find about personal finance and property investment. Not in a dramatic, revenge fantasy kind of way, just because I had learned, very concretely, that I was the only person responsible for my own financial safety, that no fund had my name on it, that no one was coming. And it was in one of those online seminars, sitting in my small apartment with my laptop on my kitchen table, that I met Priscilla Okafor. She was in the same session. We ended up in a breakout group. She looked at the notes I had typed in the shared document and said, very directly, "Who taught you to think like this?" I said, "Nobody. That's exactly the point." She didn't say anything for a moment, and then she said, "I think we should keep talking after this." Priscilla was 38. She'd lost most of her savings in a bad business partnership in her late 20s, and rebuilt from nothing with a precision that she wore as quietly as a person could wear something like that. She owned a property management consulting firm. She had a son, a husband, and a directness that I had never encountered in someone who was also warm. Usually those things don't coexist that way. In Priscilla, they did. She became the first person in years I told the full truth to. I told her about the college fund. I told her about my father. I told her, eventually, about Derek. About the 4 years we were together. About the engagement. About the October wedding I had planned and the dress I'd already chosen and the venue deposit I'd had to forfeit. And the morning, 6 weeks before the date, when my sister Tessa came to my apartment and sat across from me at my kitchen table and told me, with her hands folded in front of her, that she and Derek were in love. That it had been going on for 8 months. That she was sorry, but she needed me to know. My engagement ring was on my finger during that conversation. I remember looking down at it. I needed something to look at that wasn't her face. The thing about a betrayal that comes from inside your own family is that it doesn't arrive like an explosion. It arrives like a slow leak. You don't realize how much has drained out of you until you reach for something that should be there and find the space where it used to be. After Tessa left my apartment that morning, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. The coffee she had poured herself, because she had walked into my kitchen and poured herself coffee while she was there to end my engagement, was still on the table, half full. I didn't move it for 2 days. I'm not sure why. Maybe because moving it would have meant the conversation was over and I had to decide what came next. What came next was a phone call to Derek. A conversation I will not detail here, not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was quiet and careful, and he said all the things that a person says when they have decided that their feelings are the organizing fact of the universe. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't meant for it to happen. He said he hoped I knew how much he cared about me. I asked him one question. I asked him how long he'd known, before he proposed, that something was wrong. He didn't answer directly, which was its own answer. I gave the ring back. I called the venue. I emailed Carol at the print shop on Magnolia Avenue, who responded with a handwritten note that she mailed to my apartment, which I still have in a drawer somewhere because it was one of the kindest things anyone did for me that year. And then I called Priscilla. She didn't say, "I'm so sorry," the way most people do, which is really just a way of filling the silence because they don't know what else to do. She said, "Where are you right now?" I said I was at home. She said, "I'm bringing dinner. Don't argue." She showed up 90 minutes later with containers from a Nigerian place she loved, and we sat on my floor because I hadn't felt like using the couch, and she let me talk until I ran out of words. And when I ran out, she didn't try to fill it. She just sat there. That's the thing about Priscilla. She understood that sometimes the most important thing a person can do for you is stay in the room. I want to ask you something right now, and I mean this genuinely. Have you ever had someone use your steadiness against you? Use the fact that you're the capable one, the one who handles things, as a reason to take from you. Because they assumed you'd absorb it and move on? Because that's what happened to me. Not once. Not just with the money. Not just with Derek. It was a pattern that went back to that notebook on my childhood bed. I was the one who figured things out, so figuring things out was what I owed everyone around me. Drop that in the comments. I want to know if you felt that. The specific exhaustion of being the person everyone assumes will be fine. I read every single comment. Everyone. Because here is what nobody tells you about being the capable one. The people around you stop asking if you're okay. They just assume. And eventually, you stop telling them when you're not because you've been taught, very efficiently, that you're not okay is an inconvenience. In the months after Derek and Tessa, I did not fall apart. I want to be honest about that because I think sometimes people expect a story like this to include a period of complete dissolution, and mine didn't. What I had instead was a very particular kind of quiet. I went to work, I came home. I made precise, careful decisions about money. I talked to Priscilla twice a week. I ran 3 miles every morning at 5:45 because the specific rhythm of it was the one thing that felt like I was in control of my own body. And slowly, in the background, like a plan that was assembling itself below the level of conscious thought, I started building. My first property was a 2-bedroom in Nashville. Close to my firm, solid neighborhood, manageable maintenance history. I bought it at 31, 18 months after everything with Derek and Tessa collapsed. I ran every number 6 times before I signed anything. Priscilla walked through it with me and said, standing in the empty kitchen, "This is a good decision." That was her highest praise. I knew it then. My second property took longer to find. I looked at 11 listings across 2 states before I found it. A 3-bedroom house in Bowling Green, Kentucky, Carrington Lane. Good bones, updated kitchen, a backyard that was a little overgrown but fixable. People have asked me why Bowling Green. Why that market when Nashville was working, when I lived in Nashville, when the sensible thing was to keep building close to home. I knew exactly why. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, even to myself. What I said to Priscilla was that the numbers worked. The rental yield was solid for that market. The property taxes were low. The neighborhood was stable. All of that was true. None of it was the whole truth. The whole truth arrived the day my mother called me. One of our monthly civil phone calls, the kind we both treated like a scheduled obligation we were too attached to cancel, and said, in the way that she says things that she knows are going to land wrong, "Marlo, I don't know what those two are going to do, Tessa and Derek. Their landlord gave them notice. They're really struggling. I worry about them." She said that to me. I was standing in my kitchen in Nashville, looking out the window at a quiet street, holding a coffee mug that had gone cold. And I held the phone and I let her finish and I said, "Okay, Mom, I'll think about something." And then I sat down at my laptop and I pulled up the listing for the Carrington Lane property and I made an offer that afternoon. I called Tessa 2 days later. First time I'd spoken to her in 18 months. I told her I had a rental property coming available in Bowling Green, below market rate, professionally managed. All contact would go through Priscilla's firm. I wouldn't be involved directly. It would be a transaction like any other. She was quiet for a long time. I let the silence sit. Then she said, "Marlo, why would you do that?" And I told her the truth, the part of it I was willing to give her. I said, "Because every month you're in that house is a month you're paying down my mortgage. The math works for me." There was another silence, and then, "Okay, we'll take it." They moved in on a Thursday in March. I was in Nashville. I watched the countersigned lease appear in my email, and I made myself a cup of tea and I sat with it. I want to tell you that I felt powerful in that moment, or righteous, or certain. I didn't. What I felt was more complicated than any of those things. What I felt was the specific sensation of doing something that you have examined from every angle and still cannot be completely sure about. Priscilla called me that evening. She said, "Lease is executed. They're in." Then a pause. "Marlo, are you sure about this?" "I'm sure about the property," I said. "That's not what I asked." And she was right. It wasn't what she asked. But I didn't answer the real question because the real question was whether I was doing this for the equity or for the something else, the quieter, less defensible thing underneath. And the honest answer in that moment was that I wasn't entirely sure. What I was sure of was this: the house had my name on it. The lease was legal and fair and documented. They had signed it voluntarily. Every advantage in this arrangement was mine. And for the first time since I sat at my kitchen table staring at a half-empty coffee cup that wasn't mine, I was the one who had made the terms. For the first 14 months, they paid on time. Mostly. A few days late here and there, always with a message through the portal. Small delays. Remainder by Friday. Nothing alarming. And then month 15, the payments started coming in partial. Priscilla called me on a Tuesday evening and said, "They're at 60% of last month. I've sent the standard notice. I want to make sure we're handling this like any other tenants." "We are," I said. "Documented," she said, not a question. "Every cent," I said, not a boast, just a fact. And it was around this time, right around the first partial payment, that my mother called and mentioned, carefully, that maybe if I just spoke to them directly, as family, we could find a more flexible arrangement. She used the words "as family." I wrote those words down in a notebook. The same way I wrote things down when I was 13. Not out of anger, out of precision. Because I had learned a long time ago that the things people say when they think you're going to absorb them quietly are often the most honest things they say. I held that sentence for 7 days. And then the voicemail from Derek arrived. Derek Colley left me a 2-minute and 47-second voicemail on a Thursday afternoon. I know the exact length because I listened to it 4 times. He did not apologize. He did not mention the outstanding balance by name. What he did was talk, the way Derek always talked when he wanted something, in that warm, reasonable, slightly meandering way that used to make me feel like I was being included in something, and that I now recognized as the verbal equivalent of a hand on your shoulder guiding you somewhere you didn't choose to go. He said things had been hard. He said the HVAC business had slowed down. He said Tessa was only working part-time. He said they'd really appreciate some flexibility on the renewal. He used that word 3 times, flexibility, like repetition would sand down the edges of what he was actually asking. And then, at the 2-minute and 4-second mark, he said this: "I think you know, Marlo, that we've never wanted anything from you except to just live our life. You've been incredibly generous." I sat with that sentence for 6 minutes. I timed it because I needed to know how long it took me to trust myself again after hearing it. Then I called Priscilla. I told her to send the renewal with the rate increase, modest, market rate, completely defensible, and to attach the outstanding balance of $4,200 as a required condition of renewal, payable within 30 days per the default clause on page 3 of the original lease. Standard. Legal. Documented. Every word of it something I could stand behind in any room, in front of any person. Priscilla said, "Done. And if they don't sign?" "Then the lease expires and we follow the standard process," I said. There was a pause. And then Priscilla said, in a voice I knew meant she was about to say something I might not want to hear, "Marlo, I need to ask you something." "Go ahead. Is this about the property, or is this still about them?" I didn't answer immediately, and the pause I gave her was longer than I intended, which told us both something. "It stopped being about them a long time ago," I said. "That's not what I asked," she said. Quiet. Steady. The way Priscilla says hard things, without armor, without apology. I didn't answer that night. I closed my laptop and I went to bed, and I lay there in the dark of my Nashville apartment, looking at the ceiling, and I thought about the question she had actually asked. Because here's the truth, and I think it is important to say it clearly. I had built something real. The equity on that Bowling Green property was real. The income was real. The investment logic was sound from the first day I ran the numbers. None of that was constructed around them. They were incidental to the math. I would have profited from this property regardless of who was in it. But Priscilla's question wasn't about the math. It was about why, of all the tenants available in the Bowling Green rental market, I had specifically called my sister. And the honest answer, the one I worked out slowly, lying on my back in the dark, was that I had needed to know I could. I had needed to know that the people who had cost me the most had not also cost me the ability to act with precision and clarity in my own interest. That I had not become someone who hid from the geography of her own past. That I could put my name on a deed in that city and not flinch. And also, underneath that, smaller but real, I had wanted the math to be mine. I had wanted every month they lived in that house to be a month I was building something they couldn't touch. Not out of cruelty, out of a very private, very specific need to reclaim the arithmetic of my own life. I called my mother the next morning. Diane answered on the second ring, the way she always does when she's been waiting for a call she didn't ask for. We talked for 40 minutes. It was the longest real conversation we'd had in 3 years, and it moved the way real conversations do. Not in a straight line, but circling, approaching, retreating, approaching again. And then, toward the end, she said something I had not expected. She said, "I know I didn't handle things right, Marlo. With the money, with all of it. I let things happen because I didn't know how to stop them, and I told myself you were going to be okay." I said, "I am okay." And she said, "I know. That's not the same as it being all right." I had to put my hand flat on the kitchen counter when she said that, just to feel something solid. Because that sentence, "That's not the same as it being all right," was the most honest thing my mother had said to me in 34 years. And it came quietly, without drama, in the middle of a phone call on a weekday morning, which is how the true things usually arrive. I told her I was driving to Bowling Green the following Wednesday. I told her I would come see her first. She said, "Should I come with you to the house?" I said no. She nodded. I could feel it through the phone, like she understood exactly why, and like she was willing to accept it. The night before I drove to Bowling Green, Priscilla came over. She brought food and she sat at my kitchen table and she looked at the folder I had assembled. The non-renewal notice, the outstanding balance invoice, the move-out checklist, the letter I had written and rewritten 6 times, and she read through it carefully, the way she reads everything, and then she put it down and looked at me. "It's clean," she said. "Every word is defensible." "I know," I said. "How are you feeling?" I thought about it. "Like I'm about to finish something." She nodded. Then she said, "Make sure that's what it is. Finishing. Not holding on in a different shape." I didn't sleep much that night. Not from anxiety exactly, more from the specific alertness that comes before something you've been moving toward for a long time finally arrives. I drove to Bowling Green on a Wednesday morning. It takes about an hour from Nashville, depending on traffic. I know that highway the way I know my own handwriting. I drove it constantly growing up, every trip back from college, every visit home during the years when home still felt like a place I was allowed to be. I passed the exit for the state park where we spent that weekend when I was 13 and the vacation got canceled. I passed the road that leads to the church where my father's funeral was held 2 years ago. I passed the intersection where I used to turn to get to the hotel where I worked double shifts, and I looked at it as I went by, and I felt not nostalgia exactly, but something like acknowledgement. Like looking at a scar and knowing the exact dimensions of what made it. I met my mother at the diner on the edge of town first, the one we used to go to when she wanted to talk without my father in the room. She was there when I arrived, in her rose-pink cardigan, hands around a coffee mug, looking smaller than I remembered and more tired. We talked for almost 2 hours. I showed her the spreadsheet on my phone, the full equity picture, the payment history, the outstanding balance, all of it. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "You planned all of this." "Yes," I said, "from the beginning." "From the day you called to tell me they were struggling." She looked at me, really looked at me in the way that mothers sometimes do when they are trying to reconcile the child they remember with the person sitting across from them, and she said, "I don't know whether to be proud of you or scared of you." "Both is accurate," I said, and she laughed. A small, real laugh, the kind that sounds like something unlocking after a long time stuck. And I felt something shift between us in that moment. Not repaired, not resolved, but shifted. Like 2 people who have been standing at the wrong angle to each other finally turning to face the same direction. I told her what I was going to do. She did not try to talk me out of it. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug and she said, "Okay." Just that. Okay. And in that single syllable was everything she wasn't saying. The apology she didn't know how to make complete, the permission she was finally giving me to finish this without her in the room. I paid for the coffee and I hugged her at the door, and she held on for a moment longer than usual, and I let her. Then I got back in my car and I drove to Carrington Lane. I parked in the driveway. My driveway. I sat in the car for 4 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. And I held the folder in my lap and I looked at the house. The front garden was a little more overgrown than the last inspection photos. The paint on the porch railing was beginning to peel at one corner. Small things. Normal things. Tenant things. My name was on the deed of this house. My grandmother's watch was on my wrist. The same grandmother whose money was supposed to pay for my education, whose estate funded a semester of classes that Tessa did not finish. I had been wearing that watch every day for 4 years, not as a reminder, just because it was hers, and she was someone who kept her own accounts, and I wanted to be that kind of woman too. I got out of the car. I walked to the front door. I knocked, and Tessa answered. In the floral dress, with her hair done, and Derek behind her in the hallway, in a gray shirt and work boots, looking like a man who had been warned something was coming and had not figured out what to do with the warning. If you've ever had to stand at the door of something you built and face the people who assumed you'd never come, if you've ever had to hold your own ground in a place that cost you everything to acquire, I want you to know that the like button is right there, and so is the subscribe, because what happened next is something I needed 3 years to be ready for. I handed Tessa the folder. This is the formal notice of non-renewal, I said. The lease expires in 47 days. The outstanding balance of $4,200 is due within 30 days per the default clause, which is on page 3. Priscilla's office will handle the move-out inspection. There's a checklist at the back for the condition of the property. Tessa looked at the folder, then at me, and she said, Marlo, can we talk about this? You're our landlord. You're my sister. I was your landlord, I said. The lease ends on the 14th. Everything you need is in that folder. And Derek said my name. Just my name. The way he used to say it when he wanted me to stop being right about something. I looked at him. I held it for 1 second, long enough to be honest, short enough to be done. And in that second, I saw something I hadn't expected to see. Not defiance. Not guilt, exactly. Just a man who had made a series of choices he had never fully examined, standing in a house he didn't own, next to a woman he wasn't married to, running a business that was contracting, saying the name of the person he had underestimated for the last 3 years. I said, "Take care of yourselves," and I walked back to my car. I sat in that driveway for longer than 4 minutes this time. I wasn't frozen. I wasn't falling apart. I was just still. The way you go still after something you've been bracing for finally passes through you and out the other side. The sun was coming through the windshield at a low angle and the neighborhood was quiet, and somewhere down the street someone was running a leaf blower, which is such an ordinary sound for an extraordinary moment that I almost laughed. I called Priscilla from the driveway. She picked up on the second ring. She always picks up on the second ring, never the first, because she says answering on the first ring suggests you are waiting, and Priscilla does not perform anticipation for anyone. "Done," I said. A pause. Then, "How do you feel?" I looked at the house through the windshield, the peeling paint on the porch railing, the overgrown front garden, the door Tessa had already closed. "Like myself," I said, which I think is the answer. Priscilla made a sound, warm, quiet, the verbal equivalent of a hand on a shoulder. Then she said, "Good. Now let's talk about what you're doing with that property once it's vacant." I already had 3 prospective tenants in the folder. In the weeks that followed, I learned things secondhand, through my mother, who called with the careful neutrality of someone trying to be fair to everyone, and succeeding at it less and less. She told me that Derek and Tessa had started telling people in Bowling Green that the non-renewal was retaliatory, that I had done it out of spite, that after everything they'd been through, I had pulled the rug out. I want to be honest about how I felt when I heard that. There was a flicker of something, not anger exactly, more like the specific weariness of watching someone rewrite a story you were present for. I had the lease. I had the payment history. I had the default clause. I had 47 days of proper notice. Every single document was clean and correct and on file. But the thing about a small city is that documents don't circulate the way stories do. Stories move faster. Stories have feeling in them, and Tessa has always been very good at feeling. What I did not do was respond. Not publicly, not privately, not through my mother, not through anyone. I let the story move, because I have learned, slowly and at some cost, that the truth does not need defending in real time. It just needs to still be true when the noise settles. And the noise did settle. It settled, as my mother eventually told me, when people started asking Derek directly about the business, about the personal loan that had gone to a collections agency, about the 2 months of missed payments on a credit line that a mutual friend of theirs happened to work at. It settled when Tessa had to quietly admit that the outstanding balance on the lease, the $4,200, was real and documented, and not a fabrication, and that they had not paid it. My mother told me this on the phone one evening, in her careful, neutral voice, and then she added, "People aren't saying much to them these days." I said, "I'm sorry to hear that." And I meant it, not ironically, not with satisfaction. I meant it the way you mean it when someone is experiencing the natural consequences of their own choices, and you have been too long adjacent to that particular kind of pain to enjoy watching it land on someone else, even someone who earned it. Because here is what I had understood, sitting in that driveway, looking at the house on Carrington Lane. Tessa is not a villain. She is a person who wanted a life that already existed and stepped into it without adequately accounting for what she was displacing. That is a real failure. It caused real harm. But it is a failure of imagination and character, not of malice. She did not build a scheme. She made a choice, and then another, and told herself each time that the person absorbing the cost was built for it. Derek is the same. A man of ordinary selfishness, ordinary avoidance, ordinary comfort-seeking. He looked at me and saw competence. He looked at Tessa and saw ease. He chose ease. He has spent 3 years paying down a mortgage that belongs to the woman he left, and I genuinely do not think that irony has ever fully landed on him. Understanding that did not make me forgive them. I want to be clear about that. Forgiveness is a specific thing, and it is not the same as understanding. What it did was free me from the version of this story where I am a woman defined by what was done to her. That version requires them to be monstrous. They're not. They're ordinary. And ordinary people causing ordinary harm still have to live with ordinary consequences. About 3 weeks after the non-renewal, something arrived in the mail at my Nashville apartment. A letter, handwritten, on notepaper that I recognized before I even opened it. My mother's handwriting. Diane Hensley, who always used a medium-point blue pen and pressed slightly too hard, so the letters had a weight to them you could feel on the back of the page. She wrote to tell me that she had been going through my father's things, still 2 years after his death, slowly, and had found a file folder in his desk drawer. Inside it was a photocopy of my grandmother Eloise's original estate documents, and paper-clipped to the front of it, in my father's handwriting, was a note. The note said, "Marlowe's. Should have been protected. I'm sorry I didn't." He had written it, and filed it, and never sent it. I don't know when he wrote it. I don't know if he meant to do something with it and ran out of time, or if he wrote it just to write it, the way some people have to name things privately before they can carry them. But he had seen it. He had known. He had written it down. I read that note standing at my kitchen counter in Nashville, still in my work clothes, and I had to put both hands flat on the counter and just breathe for a minute. My grandmother's watch was on my left wrist. The gold had worn smooth in a few places from years of daily use. I called Priscilla. She answered on the second ring. I read her the note over the phone. I got through it without my voice changing, which took more effort than I will fully admit. There was a silence when I finished, a long one, and then Priscilla said, "He saw you, Marlo." That was all she said. 4 words, and I stood there at my kitchen counter and I let those 4 words do what they needed to do. If you have ever found out, years too late, that someone saw you when you thought you were invisible, when you thought the silence meant indifference, you understand why those 4 words took the floor out from under me for a minute. You understand why I didn't speak for a while. And if that has happened to you, I want you to know that I see you too. Hit that like button. Subscribe so you're here for the stories that come after this one. Because this is a community of people who know what it means to be looked at clearly, and I don't take that lightly. I wrote my mother back. Not an email, a letter. With a pen, on paper, pressed hard enough that she could feel it on the back of the page. I told her that I had received her letter. I told her about the watch, that I wore it every day, that it had been on my wrist on Carrington Lane, that I thought Eloise would have had something precise and correct to say about all of this. I told her that I wasn't ready to come home for the holidays yet, but that I thought I would be. Soon. And that the diner on the edge of town was a good place, and I would like to go back there again, just the two of us, and not talk about Tessa or Derek or money or the past. Just be two people who have managed to remain important to each other through something that could have ended that. I told her that what she said on the phone, that's not the same as it being all right, was the truest thing anyone had said to me in a long time. That it mattered more than she probably knew. I told her I loved her. I signed it with my full name, the way my grandmother always did. Marlo Hensley. Not Marlo. The whole name, like a complete sentence. Priscilla read the letter before I sent it. She read it at my kitchen table, holding it in both hands, and when she finished, she put it down and looked at me and said, "That's who you are." Just that. That's who you are. And I think that is the most important thing anyone can say to you. Not who you were, not who you survived being, but who you are. Present tense. Standing in your own kitchen, wearing your grandmother's watch, about to mail a letter that costs you something and gives you something back in equal measure. The house on Carrington Lane has new tenants now. A young couple. He teaches at the middle school, she works remotely for a logistics company. They have a small dog named something I can't remember, but that Priscilla told me with the specific warmth she reserves for details she finds genuinely charming. They paid their first and last month's deposit on time, signed a standard 12-month lease, and sent a message through the portal on their third day to ask if they could plant a small vegetable garden in the backyard. I said yes. I checked the equity statement last week. The number is good. It is a number that belongs entirely to me, built from decisions I made and work I did and patience I practiced for longer than I should have had to. My grandmother Eloise would have looked at that number and nodded. The specific nod of a woman who kept her own accounts and expected no less from the women who came after her. My name is Marlo Hensley. I am 34 years old, and I know what it feels like to have something taken from you, and to spend years quietly, legally, and with complete documentation, making sure the taking was the last thing they ever got for free. I know what it feels like to knock on the door of your own house. I know what it feels like to drive away from it without looking back. And I know now, in a way I didn't before that Wednesday, what it feels like to be exactly where I'm supposed to be. Not because everything is perfect, not because it stopped hurting, but because I am no longer organizing my life around the wound. I am organizing it around the future. And those are very different addresses. Before you go, I want to ask you something. And I mean it genuinely, so stay with me for one more minute. Has someone ever underestimated you so completely, assumed you would absorb the cost, assumed you would be fine, assumed that your steadiness meant you didn't need protecting? And were they wrong? Did you find out later that someone, somewhere, had seen you clearly when you thought no one was looking? Leave it in the comments. Tell me the whole thing or just the part that still sits with you. I read every single one, not as a figure of speech, actually every one. And your story matters in this space. If this stayed with you, like this video before you go. Subscribe so you're here when the next story comes, because there are more of them, and they are just as real as this one. And if you know someone who has ever been the capable one, the easy one, the one everyone assumed would figure it out, share this with them. Let them know that someone else has sat in that driveway, that someone else has worn the watch and held the folder and walked back to the car. You are not the only one, and you were never as invisible as they made you feel. I'll see you in the next one.